Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and we've got a great turnout today, and I hope you had a great long weekend. My name is David Turner. I'm the Managing Director here at Risk New Zealand, and welcome to this June lunchtime seminar. I would like to thank and acknowledge the support of Risk New Zealand's key sponsors who make this possible. That's CAMS, Protect, Aon, LexisNexis, SIO Global, Insurance Business New Zealand, F24 Crisis Management, and Azenic Cybersecurity. All participants have been put on mute, but please feel free to type questions straight into the Q&A panel anytime during the session. We'll be having a Q&A session towards the end of the presentation, so please ask then. And please, any question comes up, please just fire it ahead. Now on to today's topic. It's very exciting, and I know a lot of people have been waiting for this one. Behavioural science and risk-based decision-making, a case study of earthquake-prone council buildings. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to our three presenters: Dave Brunston from Kestrel Group, Charlotte Brown from Resilient Organisations, and Michael Knuth from Brands. Michael and the team at Resilient Organisations were also the double winners at this year's Risk New Zealand Awards of Excellence in the categories Risk Initiative and Stronger Together and Partnership. So this is going to be a great webinar, and now I turn it over to the presenters. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, David, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm Michael Knuth from Building Research Association New Zealand, and I'm joined here today by Dr. Charlotte Brown, who's the Managing Director of Resilient Organisations, and also Dave Brunston, who's the Director of Kestrel Group. Together, the three of us, with a number of others, co-authored a recent publication on how councils can better balance life safety risks and community impacts when deciding whether to suspend the occupancy of earthquake-prone council buildings. The decision guide that we published late last year was developed to support territorial authorities to navigate decisions about earthquake-prone council building occupancy in a way that accounts for a variety of impacts beyond those solely associated with seismic risk. Our work was heavily influenced by the application of behavioural science to risk-based decision-making. So in this presentation, we will explore how behavioural science can be applied to improve risk-based decisions. The presentation is framed around an analysis of the management of earthquake-prone council buildings in New Zealand, and we show how the individual, social, and cultural context can influence how risks are perceived, evaluated, and communicated. But before I go on, we go on to deliver the presentation, I'll just give you guys a quick rundown of how the presentation is structured. So I will start first by providing background to this work. I will begin by introducing the concept of behavioural science as a primer, or Charlotte's explanation of how we apply behavioural science in the development of a risk-based decision framework to help councils manage their earthquake-prone council buildings. I will then detail the specific challenges that territorial authorities often face when making decisions about whether to suspend the occupancy of these buildings. I will then follow this by looking at the legislation relevant to local government decisions about earthquake-prone council buildings to detail the complex array of legal responsibilities that councils are required to consider in making public policy decisions of this kind. And then I'll cap my part of the presentation off with an overview of the key decision-making drivers of territorial authorities that we identified during our consultation process with them. So here I'll give specific attention to how councils across New Zealand tend to interpret their obligations under the Health and Safety at Work Act, leading to often a conservative approach to risk management of earthquake-prone council buildings. So once I've spoken, I will pass on to Dave Brunston, and he will be speaking about the common metric used by decision makers to make risk-based decisions about council buildings, and that is percentage of the new building standard, or percentage MBS. Although an engineer's assessment of a building's seismic rating often has a determinative influence on whether councils decide to suspend building occupancy, Dave will outline some of the myths and misperceptions commonly associated with this metric. And we argue later that this leaves room for bias in people's decision-making about risk. And so once Dave's spoken, we'll pass on to Charlotte as the last speaker, and she'll introduce you to the decision framework itself that we created and how it was designed for use. But more importantly, Charlotte will detail how we incorporated key principles from behavioural science into the framework to enable councils to make robust earthquake-prone building occupancy decisions that also considers the socioeconomic impacts of building closure. Before I start, though, I just want to give some quick acknowledgements. This was a collaborative project that didn't just involve brands and resident organisations and Kestrel Group. We also had researchers from the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey University. That was Dr. Emma Hudson-Doyle, and also had Professor of Law John Hopkins from the Lead Institute of Law, Emergencies and Disasters at the University of Canterbury. So it's really important that I give credit to them because their work was invaluable in this. We also had a number of territorial authorities from across the country who were involved as well. So it was a co-design process where we had end users involved through basically every step. So just to start, I suspect that you'll be asking yourselves, what is behavioural science and how does it relate to risk management? So I thought I'd just give you a very quick introduction, and Charlotte will give a bit more detail later on in the presentation. But in short, behavioural science focuses on the influences that impact people's perceptions, decisions, and behaviours. It emphasises that human behaviours are not solely based on rational evaluations of facts, but are heavily influenced by a complex array of individual and social influences. The behavioural approach in risk management therefore sits in contrast to the rational choice approach born from classical economics. The rational choice approach assumes decision makers can rationally evaluate risk and compare the costs and benefits of available mitigation options and then make a logical decision. Behavioural science disagrees to an extent with this and states that much of what influences decision makers upon receipt of technical risk information may in fact not be entirely rational. So in the context of risk management and in this presentation as well, behavioural science leans to the view that how people evaluate and act on risk may not always be driven by a rational evaluation of known facts. Now, Charlotte will come back to this concept a little bit later, but before that, I wish to ground the concept within the context of how councils make decisions about their earthquake-prone council buildings. Great, okay, so now we'll discuss the risk management challenge that a decision-making framework seeks to address. When council buildings close, communities often go without spaces to meet, socialise and access services, sometimes leading to negative socioeconomic impacts. However, a review that we undertook of the relevant legislation, namely the Building Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, and the Local Government Act, shows that councils as building owners are legally obligated to consider both the life safety risks associated with keeping an earthquake-prone council building open, but also the community impacts of closing earthquake-prone council buildings. And many of you would have seen across the country over the last few years, there have been numerous cases of this where buildings that have been deemed earthquake-prone have been closed, and these decisions have had quite significant impacts on communities as well. However, based on our research, it seems clear to us that few councils have adopted formal policies to ensure that their decisions meet all of their legal obligations. And as such, it was unclear to us how some councils actually approach these closure decisions, including how seismic assessments are interpreted by them, how life safety risk is evaluated, and whether the socioeconomic impacts of building closure, are considered at all in their decisions. And this itself poses a bit of a risk, because without a clear policy on building closure that considers all the different risk factors, it may be difficult for decision makers to explain their decision-making rationale to their key community stakeholders, and therefore get community buy-in for their decisions. So recognising this, the core output of our research was to co-develop a risk management framework alongside councils that supports them to navigate decisions about earthquake-prone council buildings in a way that accounts for a variety of impacts beyond those solely associated with seismic risk. And mainly for us is the community impacts, the socioeconomic impacts, while also remaining consistent with the relevant legislation. So very quickly, I'll situate this challenge within the legal context of the Building Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, and the Local Government Act. So as well as their role in regulating the Building Act and its earthquake amendments, as building owners, territorial authorities are also subject to the requirements of the Health and Safety Work Act. The key feature of this is that building owners, such as councils, have a legal liability as a PCBU for ensuring the health and safety of building occupants and users. But under the health and safety legislation, we know that the PCBU is liable. And whoever within the TA, within the territorial authority, is making these decisions, they could be personally liable. And in the aftermath of a seismic event, for example, prosecutions under the Act could be possible for the individual and for the council if they're found to be negligent in the event of a catastrophic building failure. And when we talk about liability under the Act, it could be a fairly significant fine or in extreme cases, imprisonment. So you can understand that because of the Health and Safety Work Act, there are powerful incentives for councils to take a cautious approach to the management of council buildings categorised as earthquake prone. So not only do councils have to worry about the safety of building occupants, but also about the legal risks to whomever is designated as the PCBU. So it's not really that surprising that many territorial authorities have moved to quickly suspend building occupancy upon receipt of an engineer's assessment that a building is earthquake prone. Mind you, not just councils, DHBs as well, as we've seen. However, a PCBU's duty to mitigate seismic risk need only be taken to the extent that it's reasonably practicable. So under the Health and Safety Work Act, determining what is reasonably practicable requires taking into account and weighing up 5 key criteria, and this is often missed by decision makers. And one of the criteria is the likelihood of harm that might result from a hazard or a risk. And this is really important, and it's material to our discussion about behavioural science, and we will come to that a bit more in a moment. But to complicate things a bit more for councils are also subject to the specific requirements around the provision of services found in the Local Government Act and rules around decision making which apply to all public bodies. But in particular, the Local Government Act states that councils must consider the interests of both current and future communities when making decisions. So such interests would obviously need to include the seismic resilience of such assets, but also the impact of closing such assets current and future communities. The Local Government Act would therefore appear to suggest that the management of seismic risk in council-owned buildings should consider social and economic interests as well, not just concerns about life safety. And this begs the question, how do councils actively seek to balance these different types of risks in their decision making? And these are the low probability, high consequence risks associated with earthquakes, versus the high probability, low impact risks associated with closing a building. Or if they do this already, could it be done better? And in the course of our research with the stakeholders that we spoke to, the answer for them is clearly yes, it could be done better. So before I pass on to Dave to talk about the myths and misperceptions associated with percentage MBS as a metric to evaluate risk, I'll quickly summarise the feedback that we received from councils that we spoke to about the key drivers when making risk-based assessments. So here are just a few key points that we got from them in our discussions with them. First of all, most councils that we spoke to explained to us that they consciously take a conservative decision-making approach to their occupancy of earthquake-prone council buildings. And the feedback they received is clear that this conservatism is largely driven out of fear of liability under the health and safety legislation. So many PCBUs from different councils explain to us that they are concerned about being found directly liable under the Act. And even though this has never happened in a court of law in New Zealand pertaining to a building failure relating to a council building, there is nevertheless a pervasive fear amongst councils that this could actually happen. And of the councils that we spoke to, only some of them had developed or had adopted formal policies for making decisions about earthquake-prone council buildings. And much of their decision-making appeared to rest on the potential consequence of an earthquake event rather than also considering its likelihood. None of the council staff that we interviewed explicitly considered and assessed the immediate socioeconomic impacts of closing a building on the community, even though under the Local Government Act, actually that's precisely what they have to do. So this suggests that the likely short-term community impacts of immediate building closure may be overshadowed by concerns about the potential scale of seismic risk that occurs over a much larger or much longer geological timeframe. However, few of our research participants understood that consideration of risk likelihood is also a key requirement of PCBUs under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And to us, this represents a partial understanding of the legislation and also a bias towards avoiding catastrophic risk, however unlikely that this may be. When we're talking about earthquakes, we're often talking about timeframes of thousands of years. So in our research, we identified this as an imbalance in the decision-making process for the local government. And because weighing up risk likelihood is a key component of the Health and Safety at Work Act, this points to a need for a clearer process allowing councils to weigh up earthquake likelihood against the direct consequences on communities of suspending building occupancy. So that's very much what our work was about and what our publications were about as well. So that's just a bit of an introduction. What I'll do now is I'll pass over to my research colleague here, Dave Brunston, who's an engineer, to present on the myths and misperceptions of percentage MBS as a metric to determine risk. Dave, over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon, everyone. The whole question of seismic ratings is certainly in the spotlight at the moment. As Michael indicated, I'm going to run through some of what I call the myths and fallacies associated with percent MBS ratings and set the scene for us all to reflect on whether some of the more recent decisions to stop occupying low rating buildings have been based on appropriate considerations of risk. But firstly, some observations on the perceptions that swirl around seismic risk. Also under the heading of myths and fallacies. The first one is that a building that is earthquake prone or prior to that being rated as less than 34% NBS is unsafe. The next one, if we call that myth one, the next one is that a low percent NBS rating means that the building will collapse in a moderate earthquake. Linkages with language from the 2004 Building Act. We'll call that myth two. And then as we go back to the Health and Safety Work Act, as Michael outlined, there's a heavy inclination since its coming to be in 2015 in the shadow of the Pike River situation is that it requires risk to be eliminated where possible, where reasonably practicable. So all of those things, without debating the maths on the right-hand side, they add up for many people to say we must vacate the building. Let's just then reflect on that risk is a combination some combination of likelihood and consequence, and go back to prior to the Canterbury earthquakes, in particular prior to 22nd of February 2011. The likelihood of a major earthquake is low, so we won't worry too much about the consequence that led to a general lack of activity in certain spaces. However, after all those lives were lost in the collapse of the CTV building, the PGC building, and from falling masonry, the consequence of an earthquake is collapse. The likelihood just isn't relevant anymore. So we've almost got ourselves into a conditional probability situation that if an earthquake occurs, and of course the Kaikoura earthquake really reiterated that the perceptions that significant earthquakes can occur fairly frequently, this low rating building is likely to collapse. That's my take on the perceptions. Then we go back to, as we start to look at the metric, which is percent MBS ratings, where this whole journey started from. And it was because the legislation derived or defined the criteria for earthquake prone as being less than 1/3 of a current code earthquake. Of course, 1/3, proxy of that is 33. The percent MBS scale was born, if you like. And then we got down to individual percentages, and in some cases a while back, decimal points of percentages. But if you go to the whole reason that this came into be, was that which third is the building in? Is it in the obviously in the bottom third, or is it in the middle or the upper third? Percent MBS, even when it first came into being, wasn't necessarily meant to be, the specific granularity that it is taken as now. Thanks, Michael. So just to touch upon the key points about what percent MBS ratings do and don't mean, just very, very briefly, but they are a risk comparator, a risk index, if you like, comparing a particular building to its equivalent if it was designed today, but also to other buildings. They don't represent a prediction of expected performance in a particular earthquake. Every earthquake is different in terms of the frequency of shaking and distance and all those things. And perhaps the reference point here is that in Wellington City at the time of the Kaikoura earthquake, there were about 700 earthquake-prone buildings, and they suffered very little damage, but the damage was more notable in the other category of more modern buildings of predominantly precast construction, and as well as confirming that the engineering profession still has a lot to learn around what earthquakes do to buildings. It sends a pretty strong signal that, again, an earthquake-prone building is not doomed to failure in the next earthquake of whatever size. So therefore, they shouldn't be they can't and shouldn't be taken as representing a specific assessment of safety in a particular earthquake. Carrying on, that it really just reiterate that a rating less than 34% it doesn't mean a dangerous building or it's at any risk of failure. Perhaps the key thing here is that people have a sort of a perception that the percent MBS rating reflects the percentage of full earthquake loading at which the building will fail. And it's definitely not the case. The low number reflects the presence of shortcomings and the lack of resilience and the lack of confidence we have in their performance across the spectrum of earthquake sizes, but not the level at which they may fail. And just to illustrate that, it's not really widely appreciated that a 33% NBS rating means that the building has the same likelihood of collapsing in those 1/3 levels as a new building has under full design shaking. That's where the scale sort of fits in. And I guess all this highlights is how much the engineering profession needs to do perhaps a better job of explaining some of the elements of the percent MBS metric. So summarising all that, what can be taken from a low percent MBS rating is definitely heightened risk and the need for mitigation to be undertaken, and ideally sooner rather than later. But again, if the building is determined to be earthquake prone, that linkage with the defined statutory timeframes. It's not intended to prevent people from accessing and occupying their buildings before a mitigation plan with timeframes can be developed and implemented, and certainly the decisions ahead of all the information about the building being clear. Perhaps one of the challenges we have as engineers, again, is to talk more about the vulnerability of the buildings and introduce that more explicitly in that risk equation, as it were, in between likelihood and consequence. And again, this is, if we look at risk more broadly, it's something we need to do for the high impact, low probability events that Michael referred to earlier. Provide a bit more commentary on what the different levels of earthquake shaking would mean for this particular building with a low rating. And in many cases, you'll find that it really points to poor performance in a major earthquake, if we define that as a 500-year return period, but not too many concerns around its performance in a moderate earthquake. But really what this also speaks to is more clearly distinguishing between what we call the primary structure, the beams and the columns and the walls that hold the building up, from the secondary elements, such as the walls, wall panels in the images and to the right. But I guess the key point of difference is that those bricks on the upper right-hand side they would fail in a moderate earthquake. That's the whole purpose of the legislation. But those precast panels on the multi-storey building on the lower right, they're not just waiting to fall off the building. They've got quite strong connections, but just not good enough to withstand the movement that we now know the building may need to go through. So it would take a significant, if not major, earthquake to shed those panels. And Michael's already touched upon the challenges, the interface with the Health and Safety Work Act, and I'm only speaking as a humble engineer, not a legal advisor, but the intent of the Health and Safety Work Act was outlined in the 2016 WorkSafe position statement. Thanks, Michael, for the next slide. But again, that's some from a legal perspective don't think those statements are enough, and I think there's now a growing awareness of those considerations that Michael referred to under section 22 of HASWA, which starts with the likelihood, then it goes through the level of harm, what's known about the risk. This actually represents quite a good decision-making framework in itself. The main point being the account of the likelihood of the event of a size to cause structural failure perhaps needs to be brought more into play. It is the first of those criteria or factors to be considered, I think, to use the language of section 22. So at this point, I'll pass over to Charlotte. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Michael and Dave, and kia ora koutou. Michael and Dave have given a really good context to our project, and what I'm going to do is just really briefly describe the decision framework that we developed, but I'm going to spend most of my time talking about or reflecting on the behavioural science lessons that we learned and observed along the way through this project. Next, please, Michael. So what you can see in front of you is the decision framework that we created. And essentially what we wanted to do is create a framework to try and cut past all the perceptions and the biases and the things and the bounded rationality that was affecting people's decision making, and create a really robust and logical process. You obviously won't be able to see all the detail in the chart there, and there's a lot of detail that actually sits behind this flow chart to help people work through the steps. But essentially, it's a combination of decision points, evaluation actions, and outcomes, which go through those steps very closely aligned with what Dave was describing in terms of understanding what that building risk is and the vulnerability of the building, translating that to what that means in terms of life safety risk, who's using the building, how many people are using the building, how often, then looking at the possible mitigation options that there are available to reduce that life safety risk, then looking at the consequences of building closure, so that we can compare the life safety risk to the consequences of closure, and then doing an overall balanced risk assessment at the end to understand what the best outcome is for us. So it is really designed to help users step through the decision process as effectively and objectively as possible, considering all the relevant information, rather than just grabbing onto that one number of percent NBS or whatever rubric people are using. So I would say the process we developed is not necessarily groundbreaking, particularly to an audience such as this webinar, but it really steps through making sure the right information is being used. And that everything in the decision is balanced. So we're not just thinking about the impact of an earthquake, we're thinking about the impact of closure as well. And as I said, it was really necessary to cut through some of the behavioural responses we saw when we were in the early stages of the project, understanding how people do make decisions. So I'm going to now focus on what some of those behavioural observations were that we had during the project. So one of the things we saw was that there was a really poorly defined risk context. And for those of you familiar with ISO 31000 and most risk management frameworks, understanding the context is really super important in the first step. It sounds simple, but I'd say it's probably the step that people do not do the best on. And in this case, there really wasn't, in this case of managing earthquake-prone buildings, there really wasn't an understanding of the legislative framework that councils were working under. People were very aware of the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Building Act, but less conscious of their obligations under the Local Government Act. And naturally, they tended to jump towards the legislation that held the most liability and perhaps less cynically, consequences with the greatest emotional weight and fear. And so what that has done is it's led to some slightly unbalanced decision making. So really what we need to do when we're facing complex decisions like this is ensure that there's a decision-making framework that clearly and explicitly defines the full scope of the decision and all the relevant information and aspects that should be considered as part of the decision. And this will probably, hopefully, enhance the likelihood of a balanced and informed decision-making. It also helps to identify who should be making the decisions and what the priorities and objectives of the decision-making should be. Next, please, Michael. As risk managers, hopefully you all know this one, but we are not rational people. Biases play a big part in how we make decisions in our day-to-day lives and also within our organisational contexts. There are hundreds of different bias types, quite interesting reading if you're looking to do some Googling later. But I'd say in the case of our earthquake-prone building project, there were two biases that were really obviously in play. The first one, and Dave has mentioned some of these or alluded to some of these before. One of them is the recency bias, and that's the recent memory of the earthquakes, the Canterbury earthquakes, the Kaikoura earthquakes, and thinking about the consequences that have been felt through those earthquakes. Actually, as we go through time, that recency bias will decline. Often, usually in these things, there's about a 3-year window. We've seen a little bit longer after these earthquakes, I guess prompted by the subsequent earthquakes. But what we'll see over time is we'll return to the optimism bias that we saw before the Canterbury earthquakes, where people were not really thinking about the earthquakes, and they were thinking that they were too low likelihood and they wouldn't happen to them. So biases aren't consistent and they change over time. So it's really important to understand what biases are in play. And the bias that was really prevalent was the consequence bias. Again, Dave has mentioned this. So there is this real tendency to avoid the potential losses without the balanced consideration of the likelihood of the event occurring. And this is similar to other theories that are around, like prospect theory, for example, and behavioural economics, where we're much more likely to opt to reduce losses than a certain but smaller gain. So I think this is that we need to consciously look for and address sources of bias in our risk communication and decision making. And this applies to the perceptions of decision makers as well as the public or staff members, for example. It becomes particularly prevalent in political decision-making contexts, such as elected councils, where biases held publicly can lead to public demands for greater and more rapid action than is warranted. So it's very challenging to deal with. And awareness of these biases can reduce the unintentional introduction of potential bias, either through individual self-reflection or enabling others to safely question risk decisions. And so by developing the framework that we've developed, we've tried to bystep the bias by providing this logical process that people need to follow through. Next, please, Mike. So bounded rationality is the use of simplifying heuristics. And people love to turn complex things into simple metrics. And that is only human. We can only process so much information. But it can lead to a lack of understanding and consequently some poor decisions. So here, as Dave has talked about, percent MBS was really the simplifying heuristic that people were using. It's the headline number on any seismic risk assessment, and it became the benchmark by which decisions were made, despite the measure, as Dave has explained, not being designed for safety or occupancy decision making. So the lesson here, again, is that our bounded rationality and use of simplifying heuristics is something that we do every day, but it can lead to poor decisions. So where the risk context is complex, ambiguous, or unfamiliar, we need these formal guides or these decision processes to help us work through the steps in a logical way and fulsome way. Having guidance that draws together all the relevant considerations may at least partially address this, particularly for smaller organisations where relevant managers are having to consider a really broad range of responsibilities, and they're not always going to be over every single bit of detail, like how to interpret a seismic risk assessment on a building. Next, please, Michael. Trust is a really interesting issue that came up. It's a really important thing to have in a decision-making process, but too much trust or blind trust is not necessarily a good thing, and it can't be a substitute for understanding in your own context. So for earthquake-prone buildings, there's a perception that seismic assessments from engineers as experts are absolute, and they assume that the seismic assessment provides an answer and a level of safety. But the reality is seismic assessments, along with a lot of other technical fields and assessments, they're not an exact science, and they do involve judgments and uncertainty that engineers have to weigh up. So you need a trusting relationship to be able to work with an engineer to understand and unpick what these seismic assessments mean. But you, as a decision maker, also need to understand your organisational context and what the technical details of the seismic assessment mean in your own context. So stepping back, trust is not, I'll just go back, Michael. Trust is not a substitute for understanding, especially in these complex and ambiguous situations. As a decision maker or risk manager, you need to ask questions, critically evaluate responses, and establish that trust is well-founded on relevant experience and understanding the specific context. Thanks, Michael. So
responsibility and liability. Some decision drivers, like responsibility and liability, are very strong and can lead to these unbalanced decisions. As both Michael and David have alluded to, in the earthquake-prone building case, the Health and Safety at Work Act liability and general responsibility for people's safety was a really big driver for decisions, to such extent that things like obligations around reducing societal consequences of decisions were largely ignored in favour of this other one. So liability potential as a decision driver should not be underestimated and can result in unintended outcomes. The risk context and decision parameters need to be clearly defined to avoid a lopsided approach to risk assessment and decision making. And this is particularly relevant in situations where personal or organisational liability needs to be balanced with societal interest. So be aware when these are in play and the need to manage them through a really robust, transparent process. Next, please, Michael. Social influences is another key driver for some decision makers. I think in the earthquake-prone building world, there is significant experience of this at the moment. The social pressures of closing buildings will increase the more buildings that are closed. It's a typical flock of sheep situation. So even if someone understands the information and can make a rational decision, there will be pressure to follow what others are doing and not to be seen to be doing something different. Or perhaps perceived to be doing something wrong in the media, for example. So we need to be really aware of these social cues, particularly when information is complex, because it can be really tempting to grab onto these social cues and to let those guide our decisions. Social influences and cues can actually be really advantageous when you're trying to manage risk. It can be a way to increase visibility, social interaction and alignment, so that could spur people into action if risk reducing behaviour is needed. But it can also work the other way. Oh, can you still hear me?
Yeah, we lost you just for a second there, Charlie.
Okay, sorry. All right, socially defined risk tolerance. When we were doing this project, we found that the earthquake-prone building decisions were kind of made in isolation, and they weren't joined to any larger risk management framework within the council or any sort of defined levels of risk tolerance. And so what happened is the decisions were not necessarily consistent with other risk management decisions that were happening with other everyday risks within the council. So where possible, it's really good to distance the setting of risk tolerance, so through a risk management framework or risk tolerance framework, from immediate events or immediate decisions, so that you increase the objectivity of your decision making around particular things, such as managing earthquake-prone buildings. This can allow for a better balance between different types of risk and risk treatment options. And similarly, it's really good to seek a wide range of perspectives to help ensure risk tolerances are set to reflect the attitudes of the wider community or wider organisation. Next, please, Michael. Okay, and the last sort of behavioural science lesson through this process was participatory processes. So complex risks, like determining what to do with an earthquake-prone building, it involves trade-offs, and there are lots of benefits from participatory processes that allow people to talk through these pros and cons of different decisions. It can be really daunting, but it also can be really rewarding. For the earthquake-prone buildings, we saw that there was a lot of fear about talking to building owners about the life safety risks and earthquakes in general. So a lot of decisions were being done behind closed doors. But we did see some really good examples of where open and honest conversations were had with building users. And in the end, who agreed that it was better to accept the low risk of an earthquake and continue benefiting from the use of a building. And this included an example of a play centre who valued the use of the building so much that they were willing to accept the earthquake risk. So sometimes decision makers make assumptions of what building users want and what they will tolerate. And so if you can have those conversations, it can lead to better outcomes. So the message here is to engage in participatory processes where risk trade-offs are required. They do take time and cost to the decision-making process, but where you do have the time to do that, that is beneficial to your decision quality. And I'll hand back over to Michael.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Dave. So that brings us towards the end of our presentation here. Before we wrap up and move on to the Q&A session, just some key messages to summarise some of the key points that were discussed here. So first and foremost, in decision-making environments such as earthquake-prone council buildings, a key message from behavioural science that we're trying to convey is that facts are only part of the decision-making equation and often form a surprisingly small part. As researchers and building scientists, we often know that engineering risk decisions require robust scientific input. But what behavioural science actually highlights is that human decision-making is subject to a diverse range of individual psychological and also social influences that can sometimes detract from balanced decision-making. Consistent with behavioural science, our earthquake-prone building case study found that decision makers, as Charlotte mentioned before, are often rationally bounded because they rarely analyse all the relevant information available. And instead, decisions are frequently made on simplifying heuristics. And that's often highly understandable because these are people who may not have a technical background and they are receiving highly technical information from engineers. So in a lot of ways, it makes complete sense that they take these shortcuts. But as we know, and as we've pointed out, and as Charlotte has got into some detail about, simplifying heuristics can also have an inherent bias, resulting in the downplaying or dismissal of relevant information. And with the work that we undertook, we certainly saw that in terms of the importance of considering risk likelihood and the overall risk equation as well. So on that note, we will take questions from the audience. To be able to see your questions, I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen. So just bear with me. Okay, right. So I can't see any questions that have come up. So Kimberly, any questions at your end?
No, none. I'm not seeing any. Anyone have any questions, please place them in the chat area.
No, nothing at all. Look, if anyone's interested, oh, we've got one here. Here we go. What does it say? What was the response to the decision-making framework? Were people happy to use it? Thank you, Nina. That's from Nina Fountain. Thank you. Look, we've had a lot of really positive response. I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's fairly new. It was published late last year, in November, just before Christmas. And since its publication, we have gone through a process of outreach, essentially to raise awareness of the framework and the logic behind it. That said, Dave Brunston here, as a consultant engineer, has done a lot of work with various stakeholders using the logic of the framework. Dave, do you want to just add a couple of comments there in terms of the pickup of it?
Sure, and having worked through a few organisations, a couple of councils and other agencies with it, it certainly raises the quality of the risk decision making and a more careful perception of some of the immediate consequences of leaving the building, and is that really necessary? In some cases, it hasn't perhaps changed the direction of the decision. Others it has, but it's certainly informed that process.
Great, thank you, Dave. Second question here from Dave Callahan. Any comments on differences in tenants versus building owners' decision making? For example, Charlotte talked of the value of use of the building, but equally owners may wish to keep the tenancy occupied. Dave, do you have any particular views on that, given your experience with decision makers in this framework?
It's a very relevant question, and again, this is where you go back to the basics framework from the Health and Safety Work Act, where it's not just one person with PCBU responsibilities worrying about the decision. And in the ordinary course of events, there's a raft of commercial challenges in any discussion between tenants and owners, and the fact they actually have to work together to make a decision on occupancy isn't fully reflected in the in that decision-making process. In theory, the framework can be applied by either sides of that coin. Clearly, the understanding, though, of what the implication of leaving a low-rating building means, it's more directly relevant on the people side for the tenants, the occupiers of the building.
Yeah, I'd just add to that. I think tenants have different levels of power depending on the size of the tenant and also the stage of their tenancy as well. So, there is the potential for tenants to pick and choose based on the earthquake performance of a building and choose not to occupy them. But if they're already in a tenancy, when this bit of information comes to light, they don't necessarily have as much power to decide what to do. Yeah, so, but I think it ultimately comes down to the organisation itself and their own risk tolerances.
Yeah. Third question here from Katie Simons. This is a great question, Katie, and one I know that Charlotte and Dave and I have thought a lot about. So the question is, what is the biggest thing structural engineers can do to better communicate seismic risk in their assessments? If percentage MBS is the wrong tool, what should they use instead? I think it's a brilliant question, and I think it's very much where, Charlotte, your head's been at just recently, hasn't it?
Yeah, I think probably both Dave and I have been working on this. Yes, that's simple. I think part of it is demystifying the what percent MBS does, and expressing its limitations, and also just expressing the limitations of engineering in itself. So the capacity for an engineer to make a safety assessment is a common perception, and so just trying to educate people on the amount of uncertainty that there is in these assessments, and also the fact that the percent MBS is the headline figure, and actually below that there's a lot more detail that helps you understand the relative risks in terms of the different parts of the building. So I don't think it's a single one thing. Dave, you probably want to chip in here.
It's very much, as you said, Charlotte, and it's not so much that it's the wrong tool, it's just, as any tool in the toolbox, understanding scope of its application, and going back to the slide where I spoke about vulnerability. I think that's something which we just want to introduce more strongly into the lexicon, into the discussion, as in addition to or beyond the percent MBS rating, so that people understand how the building is likely to perform for different levels of earthquake. And of course, going beyond percent MBS is very challenging for engineers, because if you go down that path, it can make it look like you're making a prediction, which for liability reasons, they're just unable to live with. And that's one of the reasons why engineers do draw the line. But again, with better guidance, we'd like to think that engineers, and perhaps it's separate to, addition to their formal seismic assessment, can just take the owners, in some cases the occupants, that little bit further on the journey. And I'm mindful of we're having a debate on a project just on Friday about just improving the number from the first number that the engineers came up with to perhaps a number that actually reflects the vulnerability a bit better. This is still within the percent MBS realm, and the engineer said, "You do realise we're sharpening a crayon here," and that is quite a good reflection on the fact that, at least in engineering terms, it's a 4B pencil rather than a sharp HB. Percent MBS is a fairly blunt tool. And the ability to interpret it further is something which I think in this room we're all keen on.
So just on the back of what Dave said there, we see percentage MBS as a crude metric, and as we say in our report, it doesn't map directly to risk, right? So it doesn't necessarily give you a required sense of the risk associated with a building and its seismic vulnerability. Just moving on to the next question here. They come through thick and fast now, which is good. This is from an anonymous attendee. The question here is, are heritage values part of the decision framework? And that's a really good question, and it certainly has come up for us in our thinking. Charlotte, would you like to field that question? We've come up with a few examples within our work relating to heritage values.
Yeah, sure. This framework is limited to occupancy decision making, so it's about whether you should continue to occupy rather than what would happen to the earthquake-prone building long term. So we haven't explicitly included heritage value as part of this framework. It comes in inherently, because often it'll often take you longer to determine how to manage an earthquake-prone building that is a heritage building, because of the challenges of designing something that's fits within the landscape and the building. So there is some inherent inclusion of that, but not explicit. I think that sort of comes at the next step of the decision making.
And just elaborating on that slightly, the challenge really comes when you come to strengthen a heritage building, often with particularly the real older buildings, strengthening through the narrow objective of just to achieve life safety. But if you're strengthening a heritage building, you're actually trying to limit the future damage to it, and that can often lead you to strengthen it to a much higher level than you need for just life safety.
Excellent. Got 4 more questions here. Next one is from Richard Gibson. Are you providing any guidance on risk acceptability criteria based on context, building use, or occupancy for these high consequence, low probability events, e.g. 1 in 10,000 years, or providing comparisons with other risks people generally face? Dave, Charlotte, who wants to field that one? That's for Dave, that question.
I was letting Charlotte go first on this one.
Look, I'm very reluctant to define what anyone else's risk tolerance should be, and I think it's about helping people to define what their own risk tolerance is, but enabling them to understand what all the factors are that should go into decisions around these occupancies of those buildings. So we've talked a lot about the relevance of providing comparisons to other risks, and I think there is some value in that. There's also some limitations. So it's very difficult to find a really comparable risk where you've got a decision maker who is responsible for an organisation and public who interact with the building, versus a lot of the other risks are individual risks where there's a lot of choice, and the trade-offs and the context are quite different in the decision. So yeah, it's quite hard to find a really good comparable risk. But some people react well to examples of the relative risk of asking your staff to drive somewhere in the car or to fly an aeroplane and something like that. So everyone responds to different types of risk information differently. Dave, do you want to add?
And really going back to the basics of building risk, this is an interesting commentary on how people run with a number, and there's a table in the engineering guidelines that sort of points out that buildings rating less than 34% NBS have a 10 to 25 times greater risk to the occupants than a new building. And taken in isolation, that's a horrific sounding multiplier, but then you go back to the risk that occupants of a new building face. And the first point is it's not zero risk. But the second point is that it's 1 in a million, 10 to the minus 6. And so 10 times a small number is still a relatively small number. And 10 to the minus 5 tends to be regarded to one of those thresholds where you're starting to get into an area of concern. But in that whole range of 10 to the minus 4 to 10 to the minus 5 is that. But as Charlotte says, there's often not a lot to be mileage to be had from using those sort of numbers in a more public facing context. Relative risk is probably the best tool we have.
We don't have much time left. There's only a couple of minutes to 1 o'clock. We've got 3 more questions. We'll see if we can rush through them very quickly. From Tiffany here. Tiffany asks, how have you approached the conversation about biases with leadership? Is it good for the risk professional to be aware of, or have you conducted a session with leadership so they could self-assess if biases are present? Look, so we haven't had those kind of sessions ourselves. I mean, Dave, in your consultative work with decision makers, is this something that you consciously raise with them to help them in their decision making?
So I haven't used that word in the conversations, but the simple fact of having the conversations with people, explaining what sits behind numbers goes such a long way. And yeah, you do have a sense that some of the perceived biases or perceptions do get broken down once you actually get to talk one-on-one or with a leadership team, however large.
There's probably a lot more to say to that, Tiffany, but unfortunately we're kind of running out of time. If you want to talk more about that, feel free to contact us through RiskNZ, and happy to talk about that through with you, because that is actually a really important question and one that's worth a bit of time. Regan, what communication of the process and outcome is needed to overcome the anxiety of people occupying the building when they're earthquake prone building notice is applied to the building. That's really good. And look, we don't get into a lot of detail about communication necessarily in the framework, although we do touch upon it, because it's not necessarily our role to tell councils how to go about doing their communication. However, we did have one or two recommendations. Charlotte, was there something that you want to add to that?
Yep, sure. General principles are being open, honest and transparent about what information you know, what information you don't know, the decision process you are going through or have gone through, and also providing opportunities to empower staff to look after their own safety as well. So if they are staying in a building, what can they do? Can we develop an emergency plan? Can we fix and fasten bookshelves and other things that might move in an earthquake? So they are empowered to do something to make safe their own environment as well. Yeah, there is some guidance in there at the moment in our framework.
Excellent, thank you, Charlotte. And last question here that we'll take before we move on is from Richard Barnett. Thank you, Richard. Would you be able to discuss your findings in contrast to precautionary process, which some stakeholders may adopt? I don't see why not. I think that's a really good idea. So I guess what you're asking here, Richard, is perhaps a kind of a side-by-side comparison, so to speak, of an example of a highly cautious approach in the decision making versus perhaps what we are recommending. Look, I think that would be, I think that's an excellent idea and potentially quite a powerful one as well. One of the things that we have to be very careful and cautious of when we talk about this topic is that we can give examples, but some decision makers, some councils may feel a bit sensitive about us offering comments on their own cases of earthquake-prone decision making. So on one hand, yep, I think that's a really good idea to do that, providing that any particular council is happy to participate and be involved. The last thing that we want to do in talking about this topic is to step on toes and to upset people. So that's my comment on that. Unless there's anything else, Dave or Charlotte, you want to add?
I'd just add that I think thinking about the precautionary process or approach on a global scale, that could have quite significant impacts to our communities, because at the moment we've got about many thousands of earthquake-prone buildings and many more that are seismically vulnerable. So we have to manage this on a community level as much as an individual level, and we can't afford to shut down all our communities through these buildings. So in part, what we're trying to do is look across our population and try and do the best for everyone, the greatest good for the situation.
Thank you, Charlotte. All right, everyone, so that wraps up our presentation today. Thank you for those who have joined us to hear us. If you want to get in touch with us, please do. Our contact details are available through Risk New Zealand. So they can forward on any messages that you may have, and we're happy to engage with you. I think perhaps at this point we pass back on to Kimberly.
Yes.
Risk New Zealand.
Just want to take this opportunity to thank you, Dave, Charlotte and Michael. That was a really interesting presentation. I know I certainly learned a lot. And thank you everyone for making the time to join us at this lunchtime seminar. This webinar has been recorded and we will send it out to you within the next couple of days. And if anyone does want to get in touch with either Dave, Charlotte or Michael, reach out to me and I can get you in contact. But thank you again all, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.